afraid of the dark.
You should be.
Welcome to Binary Bylines, stories from man and machine.
Our first story is called The Lantern Man of Blackwater Swamp. In the heart of Alabama, where the cypress trees stand tall and the swamp waters run deep, there's a place locals call Blackwater Swamp. It's an eerie place, especially at night, when the fog rolls in thick and the sounds of crickets and frogs echo through the air. But the real fear comes from the old legend of the Lantern Man. Years ago, in the late 1800s, there was a man named Jed who lived on the edge of the swamp. He was a solitary fellow, known for his long nightly walks into the swamp with only a lantern to guide his way. No one knew why he went in, but folks said he was searching for something or someone lost long ago. One night, Jed disappeared without a trace. Some say the swamp took him, and others say he finally found what he was looking for. But ever since that night, people claim to see a lone lantern swinging in the swamp's thick fog. They'd hear soft footsteps in the water, and if you follow the light, you'd never come back. Decades passed, and the legend faded, until one summer night, when two young boys from the nearby town of Willow Creek decided to test their courage. Tommy and Billy were 12, and they thought that they were tough enough to find the Lantern Man. Armed with flashlights, they ventured into the Blackwater Swamp just after dusk, when the sky was a deep orange and the air was thick with humidity. They followed the narrow trail that wound between the trees and brush until they were deep in the swamp, farther than either of them had ever been. The night was still, too still.
Why is it so quiet?
Tommy whispered, breaking the silence. He could feel the air pressing against his skin, heavy with moisture and something else, something they couldn't see.
I don't know,
Billy muttered.
but we're not turning back now.
Suddenly, through the fog, they saw it. A dim, flickering light swinging slowly in the distance. The Lantern Man. Billy, being braver or more foolish, decided they should follow it.
It's just an old story. We'll be fine.
He said, his voice confident but tense. Tommy hesitated, but the pull of the legend was too strong. Together they stepped off the trail, the thick mud sucking at their shoes as they moved toward the light. The boys followed the lantern deeper into the swamp, their hearts pounding, until the ground beneath them turned to thick, murky water. The lantern seemed to move farther away, always just out of reach. That's when the whispers began.
Turn back,
The voice said, soft and raspy, like it came from the very air around them. The sound was barely audible at first, like a distant breeze, but as they pressed on, it grew louder, closer. Tommy's legs shook.
Billy, I think we should...
turn back.
The voice repeated, more insistent this time. It seemed to swirl with the fog wrapping itself around them. But Billy wouldn't listen. He pushed forward, closer and closer to the light, until they were waist deep in the swamp, their flashlights flickering.
Billy,
Tommy gasped, grasping his cousin's arm.
please, we need to leave.
Suddenly, the lantern stopped. It floated, hanging in the fog, glowing eerily. And then, out of the mist, a tall figure appeared. His face was hidden in shadow, but they could see his old, weathered hands gripping the lantern. He turned slowly to face them, his movements unnaturally slow, as if the air itself was holding him back. For a long moment, no one moved. The boys stood frozen in fear, their flashlights flickering wildly. The figure raised a hand, beckoning them forward. His voice, low and gravelly, seemed to echo through the swamp.
You're the first to come since I lost my way.
The boys' legs moved on their own, drawn toward him as if something was pulling them closer. Just as they were about to reach the lantern, the figure stepped into the light, and Tommy noticed something strange. The man's face, though barely visible in the fog, looked familiar. Too familiar. With shaking hands, Tommy raised his flashlight and shined it on the man's face. It was Billy. Older, with sunken eyes and skin wrinkled and weathered by time. His friend standing right next to him was now staring at his own future self.
Why are you here?
Tommy stammered, his voice barely a whisper. The older Billy smiled, a slow, haunting grin that stretched across his face like a broken mask.
Because I never left.
Tommy's blood turned to ice. He whipped around to find Billy, but he was gone, vanished into the mist, like he was never there at all. The fog thickened, wrapping around Tommy, suffocating him with fear. The lantern flickered once more, and then everything went dark. Tommy stumbled through the swamp, his heart pounding in his ears, his breath ragged. He had no idea which direction he was running. He just knew that he had to get away. The swamp seemed alive around him, the fog closing in like a living thing, twisting and coiling around his legs, dragging him down. His flashlight was useless now, sputtering in the thick mist. Every few steps, he heard the faint splash of footsteps behind him. But every time he turned, there was nothing there.
Billy!
He screamed, his voice raw with panic.
Billy!
No answer. Only the endless croaking of frogs and the distant whisper of the wind. Tommy's legs burned as he forced his way through the knee-deep water. He could feel the mud sucking at his feet, slowing him down. He wasn't sure how long he'd been running when he spotted the glow again. The lantern. It was ahead of him now, swinging slowly, calmly, like it was waiting for him. A voice, faint and familiar, called from the mist.
Tommy.
It was Billy's voice, but something about it was wrong.
Tommy.
The voice came again, closer now. He stopped, breathless, and squinted into the fog. The lantern light grew brighter, closer, and then, out of the mist, he saw it. Billy's face. Not the older, twisted version, but the face of his cousin, just as he had been before.
Tommy.
Billy called again, his voice a soft, pleading whisper.
Help me.
But Tommy knew better now. The swamp had taken Billy, just like it had taken all the others before him. Whatever was calling to him wasn't his cousin anymore. With a cry, Tommy turned and ran, tears streaming down his face. The voice called after him, growing fainter as he sprinted through the trees, but he never looked back. Tommy didn't stop until he reached the edge of the swamp, where the trees thinned and the ground turned solid beneath his feet. He burst through the undergrowth, grasping for air, and collapsed on the dirt road. For a long time he lay there, staring up at the dark sky, the stars twinkling faintly above the treetops. His body trembled with exhaustion and terror. He had made it out. He was alive. But as he sat up, something cold brushed against his hand. His heart stopped. Lying beside him, on the road, was a small, rusted lantern, its flame still flickering softly in the night. And then, in the distance, he heard it again. The voice. Billy's voice, calling to him from deep within the swamp.
Help me.
Well, now that's the tale of the Lantern Man of Blackwater Swamp. Folks around here say it's just an old legend, a story to spook travelers and keep kids from wandering where they shouldn't. But as you've heard, not all legends should be ignored. You see, out there in the thick of that swamp, strange things happen. And there are some lights you best not follow. So if you ever find yourself near Blackwater, especially when the sun's gone down, you might want to think twice before stepping into those dark, misty waters. Because you never know what's watching or waiting just beyond the trees. And if you see that lantern swinging in the distance, well, friend, you might just want to turn around and head back the way you came. Remember, some things are better left undisturbed, and the Lantern Man, well, he's just one of them. So remember, keep your wits about you, and stay clear of those swamps at night. Our next story is called Adrift. David sat alone in his small pontoon boat, the gentle hum of the engine barely audible over the rhythmic sound of the waves. The ocean was his refuge. He had spent countless nights out here, floating aimlessly, the water offering him solace in a way nothing else could. Tonight was no different, but the loneliness he usually found comforting felt heavier, more oppressive. It had been a year since Emily died. And while his friends had urged him to move on, to find new routines, new distractions, David could only find peace out here, adrift on the endless expanse of the sea. He and Emily had shared so many evenings on the water, watching sunsets and laughing as the breeze played with her hair. Now, her absence was like a constant presence beside him, an unspoken weight that pressed down on his chest. He leaned back, letting the cool night air fill his lungs, and stared up at the moon. Its reflection shimmered across the water, casting long silvery trails that seemed to stretch toward the horizon. Out here, everything felt distant. His grief, his friends, his life, just him and the ocean. But tonight was different. There was something unsettling about the stillness, something lurking just beyond his reach. He couldn't place it, but it gnawed at him, like an itch he couldn't scratch. David sat up and peered across the water, squinting into the distance. At first he thought he saw nothing, just the endless dark stretch of the sea. But then his eyes caught something, a faint shape on the horizon. A boat, perhaps? It was hard to tell in the dim light, but there was definitely something there, bobbing lightly in the waves. He steered the pontoon toward it, curiosity getting the better of him. Maybe it was a fishing boat or a pleasure cruiser, someone out for a late-night sail. But as he drew closer, the outline of the vessel grew clearer, and with it, a creeping unease settled into the pit of his stomach. It was a yacht, much larger than his pontoon, but it looked old. Very old. The once white paint was chipped and peeling, the windows dark and lifeless. There were no lights, no sounds, no sign of life. It sat there, adrift, its hull rising and falling gently with the waves like some forgotten relic from the past. David slowed the engine, circling the yacht cautiously. The name on the side was barely legible, but he could just make out the faded letters. Adrift. He chuckled darkly to himself at the irony. He, too, had been adrift in his life for far too long. There was no sign of any passengers or crew. No lights, no sound, nothing. David's curiosity deepened, but so did his unease. There was something deeply wrong about the stillness of the yacht, the way it seemed to float in limbo, untouched by time. Without fully understanding why, David decided to board it. Maybe it was the eerie stillness that drew him in, or maybe it was the part of him that had grown numb to fear over the past year. Whatever it was, he found himself tying his pontoon to the yacht's side, the quiet splash of the waves the only sound accompanying his decision. The deck of the yacht creaked underfoot as David climbed aboard. The air was different here, heavier, thicker. He hesitated, scanning the empty deck. There were no signs of distress, no overturned furniture or signs of struggle. Everything was intact, but there was an unsettling order to it. Everything in its place, almost too perfect. He stepped cautiously across the deck, his shoes making the only noise in the deathly quiet night. The yacht groaned and shifted with the waves, but the unease was palpable now, making the hairs on the back of David's neck stand on end. He approached the cabin door, pushing it open slowly, the old hinges protesting with a long, drawn-out creak. Inside, the yacht was eerily well preserved. Everything was as it should be, yet the smell hit him first. A thick, stale odor that hung in the air, mixed with a metallic scent of rust and seawater. David's heart raced as he stepped into the narrow hallway, his flashlight casting long shadows on the walls. He felt the weight of silence bearing down on him.
Hello?
His voice sounded small, swallowed up by the oppressive stillness. No response. He didn't expect one. He moved deeper into the belly of the yacht, the floor creaking beneath him. The flashlight beam swept across old furniture, dusty rugs, and framed photos hanging crookedly on the walls. But then, as the beam flickered across one of the doors, David saw them. Mannequins. They stood still, posed like living passengers in the middle of their routines. Some sat at a dining table, their glassy eyes staring blankly at empty plates. Others stood by windows, their hands poised as though they had been frozen in place while looking out at the sea. David's stomach lurched, an icy chill creeping up his spine. There were dozens of them, mannequins with detailed faces, fine clothing that had long since faded, their stillness oppressive. He couldn't help but feel as though they were watching him, even though their expressions never changed.
What the hell?
He muttered, backing away from the unsettling sight. The mannequins were grotesque in their frozen postures. Some lounged in chairs, others stood near mirrors, their reflections warped and distorted in the glass. He moved quickly through the narrow hallway, avoiding looking directly at the mannequins, their presence unnerving him more than he wanted to admit. His heart was pounding now, a sense of dread creeping over him like a cold mist. It was wrong, all of it, too still, too perfect, too empty. David made his way to the main salon, a spacious room in the center of the yacht. There, sitting at a large dining table, was another mannequin, larger than the others, dressed in what once might have been a captain's uniform. Its face was unnervingly detailed, its eyes more human than any of the others had seen. David froze, the flashlight shaking slightly in his hand as the beam flickered across the mannequin's lifeless eyes. There was something about this one. Something more sinister. It seemed to be the centerpiece of this macabre display, as if the others were mere passengers and this was the master of the vessel. His pulse quickened, the oppressive air pressing down on him harder now. He wanted to leave. No, he needed to leave. But as he turned toward the staircase that led back to the deck, he saw it. A new mannequin stood at the top of the stairs, but this one hadn't been there before. It stood in stark contrast to the others, posed differently, with one hand raised as if beckoning him closer. David's breath caught in his throat as his flashlight revealed its face. It was her, Emily. David's legs nearly buckled. He stumbled back, his heart hammering in his chest. The face, the hair, the eyes, it was unmistakable. It was Emily. Down to the very curve of her cheek, the delicate features he had memorized over the years they'd been together. But it couldn't be. It wasn't possible.
No.
He whispered, his voice barely audible. The mannequin's hand twitched. David's breath came in ragged gasps as he backed away. His vision swam, his thoughts spiraling into panic. It wasn't real. It couldn't be. But there she was, his wife, standing before him, frozen in time, beckoning him forward. Behind him, the door to the main salon creaked open. David whipped around, the flashlight shaking wildly in his hand. In the doorway stood a figure, cloaked in shadows, watching him. The figure stepped forward, its face obscured by the dim light. But David could see the uniform. The same weathered captain's uniform worn by the mannequin at the dining table. The figure's face seemed to shift in the flickering beam of the flashlight. One moment it was a stranger. The next it was someone familiar, his father, his friend, and then Emily. David's stomach churned with dread. He realized with a sinking feeling that the mannequins weren't just lifeless props. They were placeholders. People. People who had been claimed by whatever cursed force controlled this yacht. And now it wanted him. The figure stepped closer, its face shifting with each step, its eyes gleaming with a cold, mocking light. The mannequins' frozen faces seemed to turn ever so slightly, watching as David stood paralyzed, unable to move. The room was spinning now, the yacht's eerie silence closing in around him. He had been drawn here, pulled into this nightmare by something he couldn't comprehend. And as the figure reached out, its hand cold and skeletal, David understood the terrible truth. He had never left the darkness. He had been adrift, lost in his grief. And now the yacht was ready to claim him. As the figure's cold hand touched his shoulder, David felt a crushing weight of reality settle over him. The sea, the quiet, none of it had been real. He was a passenger, adrift in the endless night, lost to the same fate as those who came before him. The yacht wasn't just waiting for him. It had already claimed him. And there would be no leaving. Now, wasn't that a tale to remember? But let me tell you, friends, sometimes the sea takes more than just ships. It claims souls, too. The ones who lose their way. So if you ever find yourself out on the water, feeling that eerie stillness, take heed. Not all who drift make it back. The ocean's a lonely place for those who don't know they're already lost. Remember, not every vessel is looking for a destination. Some are just waiting for the next soul to claim. So, Next time you see a boat with no lights just floating there in the stillness of the night, think twice before you get too curious. You never know. You might be joining a voyage that's already reached its end. And so, dear listeners, our tales for today draw to a close. But don't be too quick to leave, for in this world of binary bylines, the stories never truly end. Shadows linger, waiting for you to return. We'd like to thank you for venturing into the unknown with us. Every chilling moment, every twist of fate was brought to life by the collaboration between man and machine. From the writing and recording, to the performances and eerie melodies, all elements were crafted by Zach Nichols alongside various artificial intelligence resources, stirring the pot of creativity. All characters and elements of the stories are purely fictional, though sometimes the lines between fiction and reality can blur. Any resemblance to real people or events is purely coincidental. But if you find yourself lying awake tonight, wondering, well, perhaps there's more to the story than you know. So until next time, dear listener, remember, the next tale is never far away. Keep your lights on and your mind open.